Breaking news today, a New York judge partially lifted former President Trump's gag order imposed during his hush money criminal case. The new terms would allow Trump to speak out on witnesses Mycheal Cohen and Stormy Daniels. The partial lifting comes just 2 days before the first presidential debate. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are set to face off Thursday in Atlanta. Earlier today, Congressman Ro Khanna spoke with Rising's Robbie Suave on what President Biden should be focusing on to secure a 2024 victory.
Highlight how Donald Trump's policies was going to make their economics worse. And so we've done a lot in passing great legislation, but I don't think we've translated it to real communities, to real people. I believe the president should do a 7-day tour through the Midwest, go right through Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, with an economic agenda.
And joining me now is the Hill's Mycheal Schnell. Mycheal, what does this new ruling in New York mean for the former president?
Yeah, Drew, the judge there in the Manhattan hush money case partially lifting the gag order against former President Trump. This comes after his conviction on 34 counts of falsifying business records back at the end of May and ahead of his sentencing that comes in July next month. Essentially, the former president is now allowed to discuss witnesses and jurors, though he still is unable to disclose names and addresses of those jurors. He's now able to do that. Those parts were lifted from the gag order, but the former president is still not allowed to discuss court staff, prosecutors, other than Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, in addition to the families of Bragg and Judge Merchan. So right there, a big development for the former president. He has been pushing for this gag order to be lifted. He has noted that he's been eager to talk about various aspects of this case. And there you have it today, that parts of that gag order being lifted. He can now discuss witnesses, people like Mycheal Cohen, people like Stormy Daniels, and he can discuss the jurors. But again, he's still not allowed to disclose their names or their addresses.
And looking ahead to the debate Thursday, what are the candidates doing to prepare? And do we have any idea about the lines of attack each of them will deploy?
Yeah, well, you said it right there. The key word here is going to be attack. Both former President Trump and President Biden are going to try to land different offensive, different blows, different attacks on their counterparts when they're on stage in Atlanta for Thursday's debate. The expectation is that President Biden is going to really lean into the issue of abortion, try to tie former President Trump to the Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case, the one that overturned Roe v. Wade. Of course, former President Trump responsible for tapping a number of the Supreme Court justices currently on the bench who played a role in overturning Roe v. Wade. That abortion and abortion rights and women's reproductive rights is a big motivating issue for Democrats. So expect President Biden to talk a lot about that, in addition to arguing that another Trump term would pose a danger to democracy and try to characterize former President Trump as selfish, say that he's more interested in fundraising for his legal proceedings rather than to try to become president of the United States. Now, former President Trump is also going to be armed with his lines of attack that trying to land those blows on President Biden. The expectation is he's going to focus on two key issues of immigration and inflation, issues that have emerged as very important topics to voters on the ground. Those two issues have consistently pulled at the top when asking voters what's most important to them ahead of November. There are also key vulnerabilities for President Biden. Despite the economy being in pretty good shape right now, voters just don't think that's the case, and Democrats have struggled with trying to find their lane on this tricky issue of immigration. So expect to hear about those two things. And then, of course, attacks likely and conversation about President Biden's mental acuity as that emerges as a key concern among Democrats, lawmakers, and voters on the ground.
Now, Trump is calling on Biden to take a drug test before the debate and says he'll take one too. I assume this is just a nod to some right-wing conspiracies and something that Biden will simply ignore?
Yeah, I mean, this is just sort of a baseless effort by former President Trump on the merits, on the basis that there's these conspiracy theories that Republicans believe that President Biden may show up to the debate on some sort of performance enhancement drug that, there is absolutely no factual evidence to back that up. There's no evidence there. But nonetheless, former President Trump, again, leaning into this issue, I think it goes into the concerns about mental acuity and fitness to be president that some individuals have raised when talking about President Biden. But I mean, there's no evidence. These claims are baseless that the president is going to show up to the debate on these performance enhancing drugs.
Yeah, and Trump's campaign is making some wild claims in a fundraising email to supporters saying he was tortured when he was booked into the Fulton County Jail last year. Again, there's no evidence of this either, correct?
No, absolutely no evidence of that. Look, we've seen the former president try to fundraise on those Georgia proceedings, particularly on his mugshot, for months now. After that mugshot came out, we saw the former president make merchandise out of it, included in fundraising blasts. The fundraising has been really key to former President Trump's campaign. And look, in recent months, the former president had been trailing President Biden in terms of fundraising, but that actually changed over the past 2 months. That with the fundraising numbers from April and May, former President Trump largely wiped out that fundraising deficit that he was grappling with in the lead up to November, in a large part because of his fundraising numbers following his conviction in the Manhattan hush money trial at the end of May. But nonetheless, the former president has sort of used these different strategies to find a fundraise. His mugshot in the Georgia proceedings have been one of his key ways to rake in the money. So I think that these allegations and these claims are just more of that pattern that we've seen for months now.
The judge overseeing the classified documents case against former President Trump is set to weigh in on an attempt by Trump's defense to block key evidence from the trial. Mycheal, what evidence is the defense seeking to exclude?
Yeah, Drew, these are arguments that have been going on for a few days now, having to do with that classified documents case. One of the two probes that are under jurisdiction of special counsel Jack Smith. Essentially, the defense doesn't want the prosecutors to be able to use some of the evidence that was taken during the FBI search at Mar-a-Lago, and particularly recordings that were taken from Mar-a-Lago by one of Trump's former attorneys. There was a box of recordings taken from Mar-a-Lago. Essentially, the defense arguing, criticizing the search warrant that was used at Mar-a-Lago. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this pans out, because again, this is another roadblock and speed bump in the classified documents case that has been sort of holding things up ahead of the November elections. Looking day by day like it does not seem like there is going to be a verdict by the November elections, but nonetheless, this is the current argument that is going on before the judge there in that classified documents case.
It's another important primary day for congressional races across the country. In New York, an outspoken far-left Democrat is fighting for his political life after being targeted over his positions on the war in Gaza. Mycheal, this is the most expensive House primary ever. Why?
Yeah, for one reason, honestly, the largest reason is the amount of money that AIPAC has put into this race. That's the pro-Israel lobbying group. You spent $14 million, roughly $14 million on anti-Jamal Bowman, pro-George Latimer ads. There's been roughly $24 million spent in this race, which is making it the most expensive House primary. $14 million of that coming from AIPAC. So AIPAC is a large reason why this has emerged as such an expensive primary this cycle. The race has focused on the Israel-Hamas war, which has pitted pro-Israel Democrats against pro-Palestinian progressives who were really incensed about the mounting humanitarian deaths in the Gaza Strip. We've seen that dynamic and those colliding viewpoints play out up on Capitol Hill. Now we're seeing them play out on the campaign trail as well, with Jamal Bowman, who's one of those pro-Palestinian progressives, an early supporter of a ceasefire, somebody who has been accused of being anti-Semitic with some of his comments about the war. He's going up against George Latimer, somebody who has tried to highlight his pro-Israel bona fides. So we're going to see this all play out in the Tuesday primary. It's going to be fascinating what happens there in New York's 16th congressional district. A lot of eyeballs on the race A to see, how the Israel-Hamas war is affecting and resonating with Democratic voters on the ground, but B, to look at the potency of the progressive movement. If Jamal Bowman ends up losing this race, that would be very significant blow for progressives up on Capitol Hill. He's, of course, one of the most outspoken members of the so-called progressive squad in the House. So a lot of implications and tea leaves to read from the results in Tuesday's primary.
In Colorado, right-wing Congresswoman Lauren Boebert is hoping to return to her congressional seat, actually after switching congressional districts, return to Congress after switching districts. Despite her many controversies, it looks like she might actually win again.
Yeah, this is going to be a fascinating race. Lauren Boebert is moving from the 3rd congressional district, which she has, been representing. She's going now to the 4th congressional district. That seat was recently vacated by Congressman Ken Buck, who ducked out of Congress early. We'll remember back in 2022, Lauren Boebert almost lost her seat in Congress in the 3rd congressional district after Adam Frisch, a Democrat challenger, put up a really strong campaign. Now, Frisch is still running again in the 3rd district, so Lauren Boebert took it upon herself to move from the 3rd district to the 4th district. It's not a done deal that she will win. It is a crowded GOP primary, but nonetheless, fascinating to see how she will fare because she's had a really crazy, 2 years in terms of electoral history, coming really close to that loss back in 2022 to being vulnerable this year because of Adam Frisch, again, having that strong campaign to then switching districts. So it's going to be fascinating how it plays out tonight and then see how it plays out come November.
And finally, we will again test the strength of Trump's endorsement in Republican primaries. The former president throwing his support behind candidates in Utah, South Carolina, and Colorado. Trump's candidates have a pretty good track record in these primaries. Are we expecting more of that today?
Yeah, I mean, Drew, it's really a toss-up when you talk about former President Trump's star power with these endorsements and how they actually end up faring on the campaign trail and at the ballot box. We're seeing from last week's race between incumbent Congressman Bob Good and challenger John McGuire. Former President Trump endorsed John McGuire in that race. The race right now too close to call. McGuire up by just 0.6 percentage points. Very likely that we're going to see a recount there. Virginia law allows a recount if it's less than 1% the margin. So, when you talk about former President Trump's endorsements, it really is a toss-up and comes on a case-by-case basis. Now, I'm particularly interested in the race in South Carolina's 3rd congressional district this week, where Trump has endorsed Mark Burns, but he's up against an endorsement. But Burns is up against Sherry Biggs, who has received an endorsement from Governor Henry McMaster, 2 big heavyweights right there in, nationally, and in this nationally being Trump and in the state being the governor. So I'm going to be interested in seeing how that one plays out as we continue to see how, potent and strong former President Trump's endorsements are. From across the country.
Yeah, and you talked about that race in Virginia still remains unsettled 1 week after Election Day. And we even hear from Representative Good that he plans to challenge some election results, the certification of some election results in one city. Bring us up to date on the latest in that race.
Yeah, well, first off, the election laws in Virginia allow a candidate to request a recount if the margin between the 2 candidates is less than 1%. And last time I checked, it was at about 0.6%. So Bob Good, who is trailing John McGuire by that 0.6%, he will be able to call for a recount if he wants to. He's already said that he plans on doing it. But Bob Good has sort of been teetering into some stop the steal movement rhetoric, what we saw, remember, back in the 2020 presidential election by folks aligned with former President Trump, raising some unfounded claims about potential mishaps that happened on Election Day, fires, procedures not being followed properly. Local election officials have said there's no evidence of any of that. But we're going to have to see how this continues to play out. Bob Good himself warning that this could take weeks because, again, we're still, waiting for an official recount to be requested and then for that to happen. So this could really drag on for a while. But, I mean, such a close race right there. And, again, as we, just spoke about former President Trump's endorsement power. This is really going to test that because Bob Good was this bombastic figure in the Republican Party. He's the chairman of the conservative House Freedom Caucus. He endorsed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in the GOP primary instead of former President Trump, earning him the ire of the former president. And then he was one of the 8 Republicans who voted to oust former Speaker Kevin McCarthy back in October, earning him the ire of McCarthy and a lot of folks aligned with him. So it's going to be really fascinating to see if Bob Good is able to hold on to this seat or if, once again, former President Trump is able to put a challenger in there who defeats somebody who's not in favor of.
A fight over GOP conference rules could have a major impact on leadership among Senate Republicans. North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis has penned a letter to colleagues who want to set term limits for the Senate leader. What is the argument proponents for this change are making, and what does Tillis say in response?
Yeah, so conservatives in the Senate Republican Conference have been wanting to sort of dilute the power from the leader, take away power from the leader and give it more to the rank and file members. And that is something that we're now seeing as a central debate as we talk about the leadership race come November. Now, two of the folks who are currently running for leader, John Cornyn and Rick Scott, they've endorsed this idea of having 6-year term limits for the Republican leader, but John Thune has not yet weighed in on this. Tillis is now writing a letter, circulating this letter that's pushing back on this idea of setting term limits, saying that they should not be taking away power from the Republican leader. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. We're only in June right now. That leadership race is not until November. So some of these small questions, or rather large questions about the trajectory of the Republican conference are going to matter. But the biggest factor, I would say, is going to be the November election to see if former President Trump wins, because if he does, he is going to have immense sway over who serves as the next Senate Republican leader.
Florida Republican Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna is threatening to force a vote on an obscure measure she says could force the House Sergeant-at-Arms to detain the Attorney General. Now, Republicans have already voted to hold Attorney General Garland in contempt of Congress. This new threat to hold him in inherent contempt hasn't been attempted in nearly 100 years. Is this just grandstanding on the part of Luna?
I would say it's a little grandstanding and a little not. And the reason why it's not is because Luna's actually going to force a vote on this. She said that she plans to force a vote on this idea of inherent contempt. And the way that works in the House is that if Luna brings it to the floor as a privileged resolution, essentially forcing a vote on it, that compels House GOP leadership to set a vote on the legislation within 2 legislative days. Now, leadership could set a vote on tabling the inherent contempt resolution. They could refer it to committee, or they could, go ahead with a vote on the actual resolution. Remains to see how it'll play out. So in that sense, it's not actually grandstanding. But in the other sense, I mean, look, as you mentioned, it's been used in nearly 100 years. It's an extremely obscure idea. The House has already voted to hold Garland in contempt after he refused to hand over the audio recordings of President Biden's interviews with special counsel Robert Hur. So how we see this issue play out is going to be really fascinating. But one thing we know for sure is that Luna plans on forcing a vote on it, and she in the House has the power to do that. So the House, one way or another, will be weighing in on this question of inherent contempt this week.
The Office of Congressional Ethics says it has found evidence that 2 Texas GOP congressmen improperly used campaign funds at social clubs. The report says Representatives Ronnie Jackson and Wesley Hunt used some of the money to pay for membership fees and dues. And Mycheal, that's what seems to be the violation here. Tell us about the allegations and what Jackson and Hunt are saying in response.
Yeah, not a good day to be a Texas Republican yesterday when the Office of Congressional Ethics, which is a nonpartisan independent entity that's tasked with looking into various allegations against lawmakers and against staffers, said there is, quote, reasonable evidence to believe, I believe that, the paraphrase right there, that Wesley Hunt and Ronnie Jackson improperly used campaign funds at social clubs in Texas. And now it was used on membership fees, on events held there, on food, on different aspects of those 2 social clubs. Attorneys for both Jackson and Hunt have contended that the funds used at the facilities at the social clubs were for proper official use. But nonetheless, the Office of Congressional Ethics saying that both congressmen did not fully cooperate with the entity, which means that they weren't able to fully see if these campaign funds were used for official purposes or not. So now the next step in this process is that the OCE, the Office of Congressional Ethics, asked that the Ethics Committee consider opening an open investigation to further look into these allegations. The Ethics Committee chairman and ranking member saying that they are going to review the matter and decide whether or not they want to launch a formal investigation into these 2 congressmen.
All right, Mycheal Schnell, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In court filings this week, Hunter Biden requested a new trial due to a technicality. An attorney for the president's son claimed his convictions should be thrown out because the judge did not have jurisdiction to impanel a jury or hold a trial before ruling from a higher court. 2 appeals that were filed with the U.S. District Court of Appeals were dismissed prior to the trial, but Hunter's attorney says the appeals court has not yet issued a formal mandate denying one of the appeals, which should render the current verdict void. Hunter Biden was convicted earlier this month on 3 felony counts for lying about using drugs when applying to purchase a gun and unlawfully possessing a firearm. On Tuesday, Hunter Biden's law license in the District of Columbia was suspended as a result of the conviction. Julian Assange will plead guilty to 1 felony charge in a plea deal that will allow the WikiLeaks founder to go free. The deal will end a years-long legal battle that started after Assange released one of the largest publications of classified documents in U.S. history. He was helped by U.S. Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning, who stole diplomatic cables and military files, which were then published to WikiLeaks. Assange will plead guilty to conspiring to unlawfully obtain and disseminate national defense information and will appear in federal court Wednesday in the Mariana Islands. The WikiLeaks founder was originally indicted on 18 charges, 17 of which were for espionage. Assange, who spent the last 5 years in a British prison, will receive time served behind bars as part of the deal. After his guilty plea, Assange will be released a free man and is expected to return to his native Australia. A court-appointed trustee in charge of Alex Jones's bankruptcy proceedings moves to shut down Infowars. An emergency motion filed this week by the trustee indicates plans to conduct an orderly wind-down of operations at Infowars' parent company and liquidate its inventory. Alex Jones was found liable for $1.5 billion in damages in multiple lawsuit judgments stemming from his repeated calls that the 2012 Sandy Hook's elementary school shooting was a hoax. Jones has continued his show on Infowars during the bankruptcy proceedings and has said he expects the platform to be shut down, but he pledges to continue his show on another platform in the future. Former President Trump's attorneys are continuing their fight to disqualify Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis from overseeing the prosecution in his Georgia election interference case. In court filings this week, attorneys argued that a Georgia appeals court should dismiss the case along with Willis for her misconduct related to a relationship she had with then-prosecutor Nathan Wade. The revelation of their romantic relationship caused a months-long delay in the case. There were multiple hearings, one of which resulted in a lower court ruling that Willis could stay on the case as long as Wade stepped down. Trump's attorney said in a statement that he is optimistic that the Georgia Court of Appeals will disqualify Willis. Any trial would likely not take place until after the November election, and Willis has previously said the case could drag into 2025. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.